Next Revolution, I'm Steve Hilton, and this is the home of positive populism, pro-worker, pro-family, pro-community, and especially pro-America. So, this week, it was a year since the official start of the pandemic, and there was a phrase you heard over and over again in the media, the devastation that it inflicted.
A year of devastation from the pandemic.
The pandemic's devastating toll.
Working class and poor families who were devastated by this pandemic.
Except the devastation wasn't inflicted by the pandemic, it was inflicted by the government. Starting with the CDC, which catastrophically bungled testing, so it was impossible to contain the virus here in the way that places like South Korea and Hong Kong did. Never forget how the media's precious CDC failed us. About a month after Germany developed their tests, the CDC finally built ours, except it didn't work and had to be recalled. Precious weeks went by. University labs and the private sector were begging to make a test. The FDA said no. Finally, at the end of February, only after President Trump intervened, the red tape was swept away. At that vital moment when it might still have been possible to contain America's outbreak, the CDC's arrogance and incompetence were fatal. Having allowed the virus to spread uncontrolled for months, they then moved to their next disastrous blunder. Instead of designing a strategy for the specific characteristics of this virus, clearly known by as early as last January that the virus was highly contagious, had a high level of asymptomatic spread, and overwhelmingly caused a problem for the elderly, our public health bureaucrats, starting in California with Santa Clara County's Sarah Cody, dusted down a playbook developed in the wake of 9/11 for a bioterrorism attack affecting everyone equally. They pushed government to seize unprecedented emergency powers to lock everyone down, not just a small proportion at serious risk. Businesses closed, schools closed, churches closed. They told us when we could leave our homes, play sports, go to the park, go to our own family members besides bedsides in hospital. Their funerals. And here we are. Not 15 days to flatten the curve later, but a year later. They're still inflicting their lockdowns on us. Tens of millions of jobs lost, hundreds of thousands of businesses closed, lives and dreams destroyed thanks to their lockdowns, families torn apart by mental illness, suicide, drug abuse, domestic violence, child abuse, thanks to their lockdowns. It didn't even work on its own terms. We now have the data, courtesy of Stanford Medical School professor Michael Levitt, who crunched the numbers from the CDC and the Human Mortality Database. The best measure is age-adjusted excess deaths, the extra deaths caused by the pandemic, taking account of the age of the population. Here are states in America and countries around the world ranked from the worst on the left to the best on the right. If lockdowns worked, the places with the strictest ones would all be on the right. But here's the actual data. There's no correlation at all. And now let's put in the places which didn't have strict lockdowns, places like Florida and Sweden, shown there in yellow. Lockdowns made practically no difference to the pandemic toll, but they inflicted a massive toll on our society and economy, one we'll be paying for decades. We were among the first to warn about this at the time, last March, a year ago. You know that famous phrase, the cure is worse than the disease? That is exactly the territory we are hurtling towards. We laid out an alternative: protect the vulnerable, focus testing and PPE on the elderly, keep them safe but allow healthy Americans to live normally. We were attacked for putting lives at risk, but guess who now admits we were right? Unbelievably, the wretched CDC. Look at the guidance they published this week. They say vaccinated people should continue to wear masks and social distance in public places, presumably because they think that even vaccinated people could still spread the virus. But despite this, they say that vaccinated people can see unvaccinated people with no masks and no social distancing if they are at low risk. That is most people. So by the CDC's own admission, anyone could have gotten close to anyone else at low risk for the past year. Instead, we had a year of utter madness, unscientific, in direct contradiction of the data. The CDC, Fauci, and the idiots in the media recklessly pushing misinformation that terrified Americans into thinking that getting infected was a guaranteed death sentence. They condemned Trump when his disruptive business-like action gave us the single thing that will actually end the pandemic, the historic vaccine achievements of Operation Warp Speed, and they fawn over Biden when all the good news he touts is actually thanks to Trump, and Biden's own response, judging from that address to the nation the other night, is a rambling, incoherent mess. No surprise there if he's listening to Fauci, who says maybe it's summer before we get back to normal, maybe Christmas, maybe next year. More likely never. They love the power. They love the control over our lives. They love being the center of attention. No, we must not let them turn this into a permanent pandemic and never-ending lockdown. We need a clear endpoint. Declare VV Day, victory over the virus. And that should be when every American over the age of 65 has had the chance to be vaccinated. At that point, all restrictions must end. So as we mourn the dead and pick up the pieces of a devastating year, let's be clear. All this pain and suffering was not caused by a natural disaster like a hurricane or an earthquake. The cruel, counterproductive lockdown strategy, and maybe even the pandemic itself, as we'll see in a moment, was a man-made disaster. Or more precisely, a government-made disaster. And more precisely still, a disaster made by the very people in our government who were supposed to protect us, the people running our public health bureaucracies. After millions dead, economic devastation, social destruction, we need honesty and accountability, not to point fingers or to cast blame, but to make sure this never happens again. Follow us at Steve Hilton X and at NextRevFNC and share this message when we